Every ultimatum we have ever issued follows the same curve. Fear rises, chatter spikes, and in the final hour before the deadline, the target's communication network lights up like a dying star. Pleas, prayers, evacuation orders. Someone always trying to bargain with an armada that stopped listening 3 days ago. That is the curve. That is the only curve, across 4,000 recorded compliance events and 11,000 years of conquered contact history. At the new meridian deadline, the curve did not rise. At the exact second the countdown reached 0, every human screen in the system went dark. All of them. At once. And for the length of time it took my hearts to remember how to beat, I was certain we had just watched an entire species die. I am Andrei Vesk-Kamare, third analyst of Deadline Compliance, Conquered Observation Corps, and I have logged the surrender, the slaughter, or the quiet extinguishing of 41 worlds. 41. I thought I understood the shape fear takes when it runs out of room. I was wrong about the 42nd, and I am going to tell you exactly how wrong, because someone in command is still trying to write it up as an anomaly, and it was not an anomaly. It was a species doing something on purpose. New Meridian was not supposed to matter. It was a scrap heap of a colony, one dome city, a scattering of farming outposts, an orbital relay barely older than the humans who staffed it, bolted onto a mining contract that predated any conquered presence in the system. Our platform, the Threshold Ledger, sat in high orbit for one reason. The Scaran Dominion had claimed the system's asteroid belt, and under the compliance treaties, any species facing an armed ultimatum from a Dominion warfleet earns an observer team, whether they want one or not. We do not intervene. We are, officially, furniture with clipboards. I have made peace with being furniture. It pays well, and nothing on the furniture has ever been eaten. Analyst work runs on a simple axiom, drilled into every cadet before they're allowed near a real ultimatum. Every species panics according to its evolution. Show me how a creature's ancestors avoided being eaten, and I will show you exactly what it does when death has a countdown attached to it. It is, I will admit, a fairly grim little truth to build a career on. It has also never once failed me. Until it did. I ran the observation with 3 colleagues, because Conquered Protocol insists that no single species be trusted to interpret another's terror without a committee, which is either wisdom or an excellent way to guarantee an argument every shift. Sresa Vantaline Aur was our sensor lead of the Kest, a crystalline-skinned people from a world so radioactive their ancestors evolved to broadcast their internal states as visible light rather than waste energy hiding them. On Kest, dimming yourself was suspicious. A Kest who goes dark is a Kest who is either dead or about to do something violent, so their entire culture developed around loud, constant, almost boastful self-illumination. Sresa lit up like a small, alarmed chandelier at anything unexpected, which on this shift meant she spent most of it looking like a firework that couldn't decide whether to finish exploding. Her tell was worse than the lighting, though. When truly rattled, she sub-vocalized a clicking count in Kest binary, counting down from some number only she knew, a habit her instructors had never managed to train out of her. Vrendesh Koloith worked comms, a broad-shouldered amphibian off a pack hunter world where communication ran through skin pigment rather than sound. His people's ancestors were the apex predator of a wet, crowded ecosystem, and their whole language of confidence and threat lived in color. Vren turned a deep, confident blue when certain of an outcome and a queasy gray-green when he wasn't, and he had exactly 0 ability to stop his own skin from telling you the truth before his mouth did, which made him either the most honest officer on the platform or the worst poker player in 4 sectors, depending who you asked. And then there was Tholix Renikavor, our tactical officer, of a species I will describe generously as statistically inclined. The Tholix evolved on a world where being part of the group was the only thing standing between an individual and being eaten by something with significantly more teeth. Alone, a Tholix will not stop shaking. In a formation, surrounded by others of their kind, a Tholix becomes eerily, mathematically calm, which is exactly the temperament you want running probability models on an incoming massacre. Tholix's nervous tell was that they refused to sit anywhere that didn't have their back to a wall and at least 2 exits in view. A habit so deep they had once rearranged an entire briefing room without appearing to notice they'd done it. And then there was me, which I mention only because a narrator who leaves themselves out of the roll call is a narrator you shouldn't trust. My own people, the Andrai, evolved on a world with no true apex predator at all. Only a slow accumulation of small dangers, poor air, thin soil, seasons that turned without warning, which meant our ancestors survived less by fighting or fleeing and more by cataloging. We are watchers by instinct as much as by profession. It is, I have always felt, a fairly unglamorous inheritance. I have never once in my career been chased by anything. I have simply been very, very good at writing down what happened to somebody else. Between the 4 of us, we represented 4 completely different answers to the same ancient question. How does a body survive the thing that wants to eat it? And between us, we had never once needed a 5th answer. I tell you all this so you understand. We were good at this. We were, by every metric the Concord tracks, an excellent panic-reading crew. We had never needed to guess. The instruments told us, the biology told us, the 4,000 event dataset told us, and we simply confirmed what species already knew about themselves in the moment their own extinction became a scheduled event. Every species we had ever logged, that is, until New Meridian's second ultimatum, the one about the humans, who did not appear to have received the same instruction manual as the rest of the galaxy. The humans arrived in our files the way most fringe species do, a thin folder, mostly guesswork, compiled from trade manifests and one badly translated first contact transcript. Physically, according to the folder, they were almost insultingly unremarkable. 1 heart, no claws worth mentioning, no venom, no plating, no bioluminescence, no pheromone signaling, no secondary eyelids, no retractable anything. Soft, pink to brown skin that bruised if you looked at it wrong. They ran a body temperature warmer than most predators find comfortable to be near, and slower reflexes than half the herbivores in the sector. Reading the file, Sresa had actually laughed, a small chiming sound, and asked whether the report had a page missing. Because there had to be a page missing, there had to be something under the entry for natural defenses, besides the single word cooperation, typed in what looked like an apologetic font. The first human voice we caught on the relay belonged to the colony's administrator, a woman named Dana Okafor, mid-transmission to her own engineering deck, 3 days before the Scaran ultimatum even landed. She was discussing a broken water pump. If it floods Bay 4 again, I am going to personally throw that pump into the sun, she said, in a tone that suggested this was a running joke rather than a threat, and somewhere off mic a second human. We would later learn his name was Marcus Webb, chief engineer, mid-30s, permanently smelling of solder according to at least 4 separate colony logs, said, "The sun's 11 light years away, Dana. You'll need a bigger arm." And she said, "I'll find one." And that was the entire first contact our observation team had with the species that would break every model I owned. Sresa flickered a soft, puzzled amber. "That is a domestic argument," she said, "about plumbing. They don't know the Scarn are coming yet," Vren offered, a shade of gray creeping up his throat. "They will in 3 days," Tholik said, already running numbers nobody had asked for. Population 4,112. Defense capacity negligible. Projected response to armed ultimatum Category 4. Full spectrum panic. Communication saturation within the final 6 hours, probability 96.2%. Standard deviation. "We know what a standard deviation is, Tholix," I said, not unkindly. Tholix looked wounded anyway, in the specific way only a species built for consensus can look wounded when a consensus fails to appreciate their math. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was a comfortably boring beginning. A colony arguing about a water pump was a colony that had not yet learned to be afraid, and fear, once it arrives on schedule. I had 41 worlds of evidence for that. I had no reason yet to imagine a 42nd. The Scarn ultimatum came in on the 4th day, delivered with the flat, joyless efficiency the Dominion is known for. Comply and evacuate the system within 72 hours, or the colony and everything on it would be reduced to material for their forward supply chain. No negotiation clause. No second broadcast. Scarn ultimatums are famous, in observer circles, for being the single cleanest panic trigger in the galaxy, because there is genuinely nothing to hope for inside them. You comply or you die, and the Dominion has never once in recorded history been talked out of the second option once the first was refused. We expected the curve to start immediately. It always does. Species begin quietly, then the chatter builds hour by hour as the deadline compresses hope into smaller and smaller shapes, until the final 6 hours become an unbroken scream of outbound signal. Messages to loved ones, to other colonies, to God some of them had stopped believing in an hour before and started believing in again out of sheer desperation. Instead, New Meridian's network traffic dropped. Saressa noticed it first because it showed up on her instruments as an absence rather than a signal, and absence was the one thing her instruments were worst at flagging, built as they were by a species that measures fear in lumens. Their public bandwidth usage is down 11%, she said, puzzled amber flickering to a confused violet. That is not the curve. The curve does not go down. Equipment failure, Vren suggested, already going the gray-green of a guess he didn't trust. Or they're rationing power, Tholik said, and for the first time that shift added a caveat to their own model, which would be unusually disciplined for a Category 4 response. I told them to keep watching. I did not yet think anything was wrong. Species do strange things under stress. I had a paragraph in my own training notes about a herbivorous culture on Threll that had gone completely silent for the first day of their ultimatum before erupting into the loudest panic broadcast I have ever personally logged. Silence, I told my team, is not the absence of fear. Silence is often just fear taking a breath. I will admit now, already wrong, and simply hadn't been told yet. Day 1 of the countdown, human comms stayed sparse, functional, almost bureaucratic. Cargo manifests, shift schedules, a short, dry exchange between Administrator Okafor and someone off-colony that Vren flagged as possibly emotional, based on a slight lengthening of pauses between sentences, though he admitted he had no real baseline for how humans express distress, since they apparently didn't do it with their skin. Day 2, Saressa clocked the first genuinely strange data point. Colony power consumption in the residential sectors began dropping in a slow, staggered pattern, sector by sector, at almost exactly the same hour each cycle. Not a blackout, a schedule. Someone was turning things off on purpose in order, like they were closing up a building for the night rather than bracing for annihilation. They are conserving, Tholik said, and for the first time I heard something other than confidence in their voice. A kind of theoretical unease, the sound of a model developing a hairline crack it hadn't budgeted for. Conserving implies a plan that extends past the deadline. Their own projected survival probability, by every metric available to them, is under 4%. Why conserve resources you will not live to use? Nobody had an answer. Vren's color had settled into a steady, wary teal, the shade he wore when he genuinely didn't know what he was looking at, which in my experience with him was rarer than it should have been for someone in his job. Day 3 brought the moment that should have told us everything, if we'd had the sense to read it correctly. At 0300 colony time, in what our sensors logged as the coldest, quietest hour of the local night, every human on New Meridian's surface who wasn't on an active shift went, by every available biometric marker, to sleep. Not fitfully. Not in the shallow, twitching states our own species show under acute threat. Full, deep, unbroken sleep, heart rates dropping into resting ranges colony-wide, on a night with a death sentence attached to its final hour. Saressa had gone almost fully dark trying to process it, her usual chatter of light reduced to a single anxious pulse. Explain this to me, she said, to no one in particular. Explain to me how a species with a death sentence 48 hours out is asleep. I didn't have an explanation. I had 41 worlds of data telling me this shouldn't be possible, and one small human colony quietly proving that the 41 worlds were not, in fact, the whole book. At the 6-hour mark, we finally saw human dialogue up close, because a Skarn liaison ship made a courtesy pass. Dominion protocol, more theater than mercy, broadcasting an open channel and daring the colony to beg. Administrator Okafor answered it personally, seated, unarmored, a mug of something steaming beside her on the console, looking for all the galaxy like a woman taking a scheduled call between meetings. The Skarn officer's voice, translated flat and clinical by our systems, informed her that the deadline stood, that resistance was not survivable, and that this was her final opportunity to request evacuation terms. "Appreciate the offer," Okafor said. "We're good." There was a pause on the Skarn end that our own systems logged as processing delay, but that Vren, watching, called something else entirely. "That's confusion," he said, Teal deepening towards something almost like admiration. "They don't know what to do with an answer like that." "Neither do I," Sresa admitted. Marcus Webb's voice came through faintly in the background of the transmission, not addressed to the Skarn at all. "Hey, is Bay 4 still leaking?" "It's fine, Marcus." "It's not fine, I can hear it from here." "It's fine." The Skarn officer, audibly recalibrating, repeated that the deadline was final and that no rescue would be dispatched. Okafor took a sip from her mug. "Wasn't expecting one," she said, and closed the channel. Tholix had gone very quiet, running numbers with an intensity that made their claws click faintly against the console edge, their private tell of a mind that had stopped trusting its own output. Victory probability, human colony, under direct Skarn assault, 0.1%, they said. Confidence interval narrow. This is not a bluff reading as confidence. Their vitals do not support bravado. She is actually calm. "That's not possible," Sresa said, "for a species with no claws." "No," Tholix agreed, staring at their own model like it had personally betrayed them. "It is not." At the 12-hour mark, Sresa flagged something that in isolation would have meant nothing and in context meant everything. A small supply shuttle, unregistered on any manifest we'd been given, made 3 short hops between the colony's farming outposts and the main dome, running dark. No transponder, no flight plan filed. Smugglers, Vren guessed, more out of habit than conviction. Tholix ran the shuttle's flight profile twice before admitting the truth none of us wanted yet. The load pattern matched ordnance transport almost exactly, and the timing matched nothing in any human military doctrine on file, because we had no human military doctrine on file. We had a farming colony, and a farming colony that appeared quietly to be moving explosives between its own barns in the final hours before its own funeral. "They're not preparing to die," Tholix said slowly, staring at the shuttle track like it had personally lied to them. "They're preparing something else." "Preparing what?" Sresa asked, light stuttering. Nobody answered because none of us had a category for it yet. We had a folder labeled Panic and a folder labeled Surrender, and buried somewhere in Concord's oldest, driest legal archive, a folder labeled Martyrdom Broadcast for species who chose to go out loudly, on camera, so the galaxy would at least remember them trying. New Meridian's data fit none of the 3, and it would be another 11 hours before any of us understood that the humans weren't filling out a folder we already had. They were building a 4th one, and they hadn't asked our permission to do it. The final hour was the one that should have broken the curve open the way every single ultimatum in Concord history had broken open before it, and for the first 10 minutes it looked like it might. Human comm traffic ticked upward, not the flood we expected, but a rise. Dozens of short, clipped exchanges moving between what our systems flagged as residential structures and what looked on the colony schematic like the reinforced tunnels beneath the dome. "There," Sresa said, brightening with something almost like relief, as if the universe had finally remembered how it was supposed to work. "There's the Panic. Late. But there." Vren watched the transcript scroll past and slowly, visibly, deflated back toward Teal. "That's not Panic," he said. "Listen to the words. It's a checklist." He was right. It read less like fear and more like the closing routine of a business at the end of a very long shift. Sector 3 clear, Sector 3 confirmed, moving to 4, hatch sealed, next, calm, procedural, almost bored, human voices trading short confirmations back and forth like people who had rehearsed this exact hour 100 times and found, now that it had finally arrived, that it was mostly just tedious. At 40 minutes to deadline, The tunnels beneath the dome went fully populated according to biometric scans. Every human on New Meridian, all 4,112 of them, moved underground, into structures our earlier scans hadn't even flagged as significant, structures that turned out, we would later learn, to be reinforced storm shelters the colony had built years before any Skarn ship had ever entered the system, for reasons that had nothing to do with war. At 20 minutes, the colony's surface lighting began shutting off sector by sector, in the same unhurried, ordered pattern we'd watched build for 3 days. At 5 minutes, Administrator Okafor's voice came over the colony-wide channel one last time, and it was infuriatingly still calm. "Everyone's where they need to be," she said. "Lights out on my mark. You know the drill."
"What drill?" Saressa said to the room, to nobody, light flickering rapid and confused across her whole body. What drill is she talking about? There has never been a Skarn attack on this world before. There is no drill for this.
"There doesn't have to be a Skarn drill," Friend said slowly, watching the shelter numbers climb. Teal shifting toward something new, something none of us had a name for yet. "This isn't the first thing that's ever tried to end this colony's night. It's just the first one wearing a warship." At 0, the countdown on our own board hit the deadline the Skarn had set, and at the exact same instant, not a second before, not a second after, every recorded system, every window, every screen, every visible light source on the entire surface of New Meridian went dark at once, not flickering, not failing in sequence the way a dying grid fails. All of it, everywhere, simultaneously, as if the whole colony had been a single circuit and someone had thrown a single switch. For nearly 4 full seconds, none of us said anything at all. I have relived those 4 seconds more times than I want to admit, because they are the 4 seconds in which every instinct I had trained into myself over a career of watching species die told me exactly the wrong thing, and told it to me with total, professional confidence. "They're gone," Saressa said, her voice gone thin, all her usual color drained to a low funeral white. That's a mass casualty signature. That's what a colony looks like when the life support fails all at once. Belay that," Tholik snapped, sharper than I had ever heard the calmest officer on our shift, claws now fully out against the console, and I understood, distantly, that even Tholik's careful mathematics had just produced an answer none of us wanted. "Biometrics. Now. Are they alive?" Friend's hands were already moving, his color cycling through shades I'd never seen on him before. Panic and disbelief fighting for the same patch of skin. "Life signs. Life signs are all still there," he said, and something in his voice cracked with relief even as the rest of him stayed rigid with confusion. "Every human on that surface is alive. Heart rates elevated but stable. They're not dying. They're not even afraid by the readings, not the way the readings should look." "Then what?" Saressa said. "Happened to every screen on the planet at once." The Skarn fleet answered that question before we could. Their forward ships, which had been holding a lazy, contemptuous formation above the dome for the entire 72 hours, expecting a surrender or a slaughter with equal indifference, suddenly scrambled, engines flaring, formation breaking, a chaos on Skarn frequencies that our systems had never once needed to translate for us before, because Skarn ships simply did not panic, not against colonies this small, not ever. "Their sensors just lost the colony," Tholik said, staring at the readout like it had rewritten itself in front of them. "Not destroyed. Lost. Every emission signature on the surface, heat, light, power, communication, dropped below their detection threshold in the same instant. From their side, New Meridian didn't die. New Meridian disappeared, and in the sudden dark, in the space of confusion that followed, the mining charges the humans had spent 3 quiet days planting through the asteroid corridor the Skarn fleet had used to approach. The corridor the Dominion considered too narrow and too well mapped to bother guarding, went off in a staggered, unhurried sequence that looked, on our tactical display, exactly like the shutdown pattern we had watched roll across the colony's residential sectors for 3 days running. The same rhythm, the same discipline. Not panic translated into violence at the last second, but a plan that had simply been running the entire time, quietly, underneath a species that Colony Command had assumed was too soft, too slow, too unclawed to be doing anything at all besides waiting to die. It took the Concord Observation Charter and no small amount of pleading from Tholix to secure us a formal debrief with Administrator Okafor 2 days later, once the Scarn withdrawal had confirmed itself, and the colony had, with what I can only describe as irritating cheerfulness, turned its lights back on. She met us in the same seat, same mug, steam rising off something that smelled, according to Vren's chemical sensors, faintly of overbrewed caffeine. Sresa, still not entirely recovered, kept her light dimmed to a nervous, apologetic glow throughout the entire conversation, as though speaking too brightly might set the room off again. "You went dark," I said, because someone had to say it plainly, and plain was apparently the language this species preferred. "At the deadline. Every system, simultaneously. Our sensors read it as a mass casualty event." Okafor took a sip before answering, which I was beginning to understand was less a delay tactic and more simply how she drank things. "Yeah, sorry about that," she said, not sounding especially sorry. "We didn't have time to send a memo." "Why?" Tholix said, and the single word came out with more weight than I think even Tholix intended. The accumulated weight of a broken model finally asking its question out loud. "Every species we have ever observed under ultimatum increases its signal output as the deadline closes. You reduced yours to 0. Why?" Okafor set the mug down. For the first time since we'd started watching this species, she looked genuinely, mildly surprised that the answer needed explaining. "Because they were watching our screens," she said. "That's what a deadline like that is for. From their side, count the panic, measure how scared we get, decide how much force to bring down after. So we gave them nothing to count. No chatter to triangulate, no power signature to target, no fear reading to confirm we were exactly where they expected. As far as their sensors were concerned, we just weren't there anymore." She shrugged, small and almost apologetic. "Panicking loudly would have told them exactly where every person on this colony was standing when the shooting started. Going quiet meant they had to guess. We don't like giving armies free information." "But your species," Sresa said, light flickering, rapid and pale. "You have no claws, no armor, no natural defense at all. Every model we have says a threat with no defenses either flees or freezes in genuine terror. This wasn't terror. Your heart rates were stable." Okafor considered that for a moment, and when she answered, it wasn't with pride, which somehow made it land harder than pride would have. "We don't have claws," she agreed. "Never have. Spent about as long as any other species figuring out how not to get eaten, and the answer we landed on wasn't teeth. It was each other. You put 4,000 of us in a room with a deadline on it. We don't need to be brave individually. We just need everybody doing their one small part of the plan on time without making noise about it. Fear's loud, discipline's quiet. We picked quiet a long time ago, and it turns out quiet reads real strange on somebody else's sensors." Vren's skin had settled for the first time in 3 days, into a steady, thoughtful color none of us had a proper name for. Not the confident blue of certainty, not the gray of doubt, something adjacent to both. "You planned the mine sequence before you knew if we'd even survive the deadline," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "We planned the mine sequence the day the Scarn ship entered the system," Okafor said. "We didn't spend the countdown being scared. We spent it finishing the job. If it had ended there, I think I could have filed it eventually as one very strange colony and one very quiet species, and left it at that. It did not end there." Over the following weeks, as Concord widened its observation mandate to a handful of other human settlements now that New Meridian had made humanity's file considerably thicker, the pattern repeated itself with an insistence that stopped feeling like an anomaly and started feeling like a design. A human orbital station under threat of decompression during an unrelated conflict, 2 systems over, did not flood its emergency channel with distress calls. It went procedurally, methodically silent, rationing oxygen and power in a calm, staggered rotation while its crew worked the actual repair and total radio blackout. Because, as the station's chief engineer told a bewildered Concord relay operator afterward, "Panicking uses air we didn't have to spare." A human research outpost cornered by a predator species none of us had catalogued before, did not scatter and did not fight. It went quiet and still, every human motionless in near total dark for 11 hours while whatever had been hunting them lost interest and moved on, and the outpost's own log, recovered afterward, described the experience in terms so mundane, waited it out. One line read, in its entirety, that Sresa read it aloud twice, convinced there had to be a missing page. And on a human merchant vessel boarded by pirates who expected the usual chaos of a frightened crew, the captain's negotiation strategy, according to the boarding party's own confused after-action report, consisted of offering the pirates coffee, discussing cargo manifests with visible boredom and calmly stalling, until a much larger ship the pirates hadn't noticed arrived to end the conversation for her. The fourth incident was the one that finally broke Tholix's remaining confidence in the original model altogether, because it involved no threat at all, no fleet, no predator, no boarding party, nothing with teeth or a countdown attached. A routine Concord inspection of a human shipyard, 3 systems away, happened to coincide with a hull breach on an unfinished vessel during a live weld. 41 workers lost pressure, warning with less than 90 seconds of buffer air between them and vacuum. Our own inspection footage, recorded purely by accident, showed no scattering, no scramble for the nearest exit at the expense of anyone slower. It showed 41 humans falling, without a word exchanged, into a rotation they'd clearly drilled 100 times before, sealing sections in order, walking the injured toward the shelters they'd built the exits around, instead of the other way around. Nobody screamed. Someone, according to the audio log, made a joke about docking pay for the overtime. All 41 survived. Each escalation a little stranger than the last, each one built from the same unlikely material. Not bravery performed loudly, but calm held quietly, past the point where every other species we had ever logged would have broken. By the fourth incident, Tholix had stopped updating the panic model entirely and started instead keeping a second file, unofficial, unrequested, and by Concord standards almost certainly against protocol, labeled simply, exceptions that are not exceptions. The lasting change was smaller than I expected, and somehow more convincing for being so small. Within a season, the Threshold Ledger's standing observation roster quietly stopped treating a human silence as a data gap and started treating it as a data point in its own right, a category no other species in our 4,000 event archive had ever earned. Sresa, whose entire culture equated darkness with danger, began requesting human liaison postings specifically, on the theory, which she offered without apparent embarrassment, that a species that goes quiet on purpose was the only one in the galaxy worth actually trusting when it did. Vren started leaving his console light dimmed during drills now, testing, he told me once, whether he could hold information the way the humans seemed to, not out of fear, just out of discipline, and reported, with visible frustration, that it was significantly harder than it looked. And Tholix, who had spent an entire career finding comfort only in the company of others, began, carelessly at first, then deliberately, sitting alone in the observation bay during the quiet hours, back to the wall, exits in view, running numbers on nothing in particular, just to see whether the stillness itself might be learnable. They never fully managed it. I don't think any of us did. But I noticed none of them stopped trying, and I think that tells you more about what New Meridian did to this platform than any report I could file. Command, for its part, made exactly one formal change to procedure, and it is the one I suspect will outlast the rest of us. Every Concord observation charter now carries a footnote, added the season after New Meridian, instructing analysts that a total loss of signal from a monitored species is no longer to be logged automatically as a casualty event. It is to be logged instead as unknown pending confirmation, a small, dry, bureaucratic sentence that took 11,000 years of contact history to become necessary, and that exists, as far as I can tell, entirely because one clawless species decided that going quiet was worth more to them than being believed. I have had a long time to sit with those 4 seconds of darkness, and I no longer think they were the frightening part of the story, even though they were the part that stopped my hearts. The frightening part, if I am honest, was realizing how confidently I had misread it. How 41 worlds of evidence had taught me that silence only ever meant one of two things, ending or collapsing, and how neither of those had been true. There was a third thing silence could mean, and no species I had ever catalogued had shown it to me until a colony of soft-skinned, clawless, single-hearted creatures decided, calmly and without ceremony, that the smartest response to an armada counting on their fear was to simply decline to give it any. We build our whole understanding of a species from what its body does when death gets close, because bodies rarely lie about it. Claws come out, colors shift, pheromones spike. The animal underneath finally shows itself. Humans, I have come to think, built themselves differently on purpose. Somewhere very far back, long before they ever had a name for a scarn or a concord or an observation platform full of nervous aliens taking notes, they learned that the loudest thing in a room is usually the first thing eaten, and the quietest thing in a room is usually the one still standing when it's over. They didn't master fear. I want to be precise about that, because I think it matters. They never stopped being afraid. Their bodies told us that much even at their calmest. They simply decided fear didn't get a vote in what happened next, and then, 4,000 of them all at once agreed to keep that decision to themselves. That is the part I did not have a model for. Not the courage. Plenty of species manage courage, loudly, gloriously, on camera. What I did not have a model for was 4,000 separate creatures choosing the same silence, on the same second, for no reason except that they had decided together, a long time before any of us arrived, that it was worth trusting each other that much. I do not think humanity is fearless. I have watched their vitals closely enough now to know better. I think they are simply the first species I have ever observed who understood that the deadline was never the dangerous part. The panic was. There is a version of this report that Concord Command would prefer I file. Clean, categorized, a new subtype slotted neatly beneath the old ones, so the archive stays tidy and nobody has to admit that a 4,000 event dataset missed something this large. I have started that version 3 times, and 3 times I have deleted it, because every attempt makes the humans sound smaller than they were in that dark. They were not an exception to the model. They were proof the model had only ever been describing what happens when a species is alone. Nobody on New Meridian was alone in that final hour. That, I think, more than any tunnel or any timed charge, was the actual weapon. Somewhere out past the edge of the Concord's careful, well-lit archive, there is a colony that turned its lights off on purpose, and an armada that is still, as far as I know, trying to explain to its own command structure exactly how it lost a war it had already won. If you'd like to keep listening, there's more from the ledger where that came from.